Good morning here. Good afternoon, wherever you are. We're so super lucky because today is Indigenous Peoples Day. Some people used to call it Columbus Day, and in a lot of the country, it's been appropriately renamed Indigenous Peoples Day. And we're really lucky to have Chrissie Castro with us, who is a leader in Native American vote and Indigenous Peoples rights. I'm just going to read a quick bio. Chrissie, just want to make sure we can see you and hear you.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Thanks. So Chrissie Castro is Diné, which means she's a member of the Navajo Nation and Chicana. She is the chairperson of the Los Angeles City and County Native American Indian Commission, and she co-led the change to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in the City and County of Los Angeles. She was a co-founder of Indigenous Women Rise, which organized the Indigenous Women contingent of 1,000 Indigenous women at the Women's March in DC. She's the network weaver of Native Voice Network, a national network of 35 plus Native-led organizations that mobilize through Indigenous cultural values. And she recently launched 2 projects to build community and political power of Native communities. Locally, the California Native Vote Project, and nationally, Advanced Native Political Leadership. She's been writing about what matters to Native voters and why presidential candidates should be listening to Native peoples. And we are so lucky to have you with us. Thank you for spending this day with us, Chrissie, which I'm sure is busy for you in so many ways.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Saru. First of all, happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I am calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tongva peoples, and also have a responsibility to the Tataviam and Chumash peoples, who also are the original tribes of the greater LA County area. If you want to go ahead and drop, I guess you're all in the same area, but maybe you come from different places. So if you know the Indigenous communities from which you come from, where you've been raised, if you want to drop that into the chat, just so we have some sense of, the diversity of lands that you'll have been raised on, that would be fantastic. And if you don't know, that's okay too. But maybe this is a day for you to have that reflection and to consider that as well. So thank you so much, Saru, for inviting me to speak on this. The first thing I'll say is that when I was in my 20s, I'm like listening to Saru's introduction, and I'm like, I never would have thought that would be me. Like, I'd be the person that is working on so much voter issues. My politics we're way left. I'm like, just like, F the system, this thing does not work for us. So I really empathize and understand where our young people are coming from, many of whom have that feeling now, right? So I'll say that there have been many pivotal moments that have actually had me full swing to think a different way and to do the work that I'm doing, because I see it as a tactic and as a strategy. So I'll say that the most powerful experience that really changed my mind and my view of this was actually when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was signed. So I was part of an Indigenous delegation that went to Berkeley to celebrate. And even before that, I was part of an international Indigenous leadership fellowship that we've basically visited Bolivia right when Evo Morales was first elected as president. And what we did is we traveled across the country to really understand their movement work in Bolivia. And it was amazing to see, like, Evo Morales was the kind of, obviously at the greatest point of position in that country. But what was beautiful to see was that it was more of a movement. It was a wave of Indigenous peoples taking up mayorships and taking, all throughout their government system, taking up leadership and actually making decisions for that country based on Indigenous value systems. Now, I'm not saying any leader is perfect, but it's really about the movement for me that was, really called me in to say, that this is actually possible. We could actually transform these systems. And the other very, very exciting thing to me was that Bolivia is the place that has the most gender parity as it pertains to representation in elected office. So it wasn't just Indigenous men, there were so many Indigenous women that were taking up this leadership. And I really believe that in order for us to really transform and make it, on these lands, that we are going to have to rematriate leadership. And Indigenous women held, we're matrilineal, matrilocal people for the most part. And we had held positions of power, and we were leaders, and we were recognized as such. And we also did not just have two genders. We didn't have just men and women. We had, some tribes had 8 and 9 genders. We're very gender fluid societies that understood that we all have a critical role to play, and that's actually a gift to families. And so I really believe that for me, indigenizing and coming back to Indigenous value systems and the ways that we choose to prioritize decisions that we make are what's not only going to save Native and Indigenous peoples in this country, but it's going to save us all. And that we all have a place in that, because Indigenous value systems are really about relationships. It's about redistribution. So the idea that, we didn't show wealth by hoarding it and accumulating it. We showed our wealth by how much we could give away. And, so like these value systems and reciprocity, like we see that we have a relationship, not only with each other as human beings, but we have a relationship with the earth and the water. And if we don't take care of those things, that we're not going to be taken care of. So I really see the chaos and the devastation and all of the things that are happening as huge, huge red flags. Some people don't see it as that, but I just see them as huge red flags that we are a society that's so out of balance and out of order. And so, I just open up by saying that because, there's people in our community, I'll say, that are very resistant to this idea of voting because for very good reasons, right? For all of the mistrust of government that has happened, from contact to now. But I really see it as a critical piece of a larger movement building strategy that is about organizing and leadership development and all of these other kinds of work. So I feel like it's part of a much larger strategy. So I'm gonna stop there and just make sure like I'm in the right vicinity of what I'm supposed to be talking about, Saru. Okay.
For sure. And if you don't mind walking through your journey of, I so feel you, starting from a place of why would we even be talking about voter engagement to now coming full circle. If you could just walk us through that journey, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. Well, I also wanted to just share the history of voting rights for Native Americans in the country, if that would be okay. So basically, we originally, the government managed its relationship with Native American people through a department that no longer exists, but it was called the U.S. Department of War. So we were not seen as citizens. If you look at the Constitution, I think they call us like merciless savage Indians or something like that. And I think the president just put out a similar rhetoric a day or two ago about Columbus Day and the radicals that are trying to change it to Indigenous Peoples Day. So, oh my gosh, it's so, it shouldn't be shocking, but it's so shocking to me that white supremacist mentality that began colonization through, I don't know if you all are aware, but during contact, as the Columbus came into the Caribbean, there was actually a papal bull. So it's like the Pope's decree, a papal bull that basically said that it was called the Doctrine of Discovery, which meant that if people from Europe that were Christian came to any lands and found people that were not Christian, that those lands are actually vacant because those people are not really human beings. And so that's why there's like, that they have the legal and religious authority to take and claim those lands. So for me, when we talk about like white supremacist structures, which we're trying to erode, like for us, like that's the starting point of white supremacy. And so, you know, we don't, you know, I can't give 500 years of history in 10 minutes. We're like, you know, our educational systems are on purpose do not tell us these things, right? As we're going through our various systems and we're working to change that. But, you know, I feel like I have to start there because there's just been so many different waves of policy that have been, you know, stripping us of our lands, stripping us of our identity, moving us away from our traditional ways of even sustaining ourselves and our food systems. And so creating this dependent relationship with the government is basically, you know, the strategy. And if you look at US federal Indian policy all throughout, you know, since the formation of this country, you see that what they're trying to do is solve the Indian problem. And depending on who is in power, like even as people are like, you would think that people are trying to do good, it was still bad for us. So it's either the policies would either be straight out like genocidal, you know, violent, or it would be like assimilative. The people that are trying to help us was assimilative. And, you know, I have a really good mentor that she's so funny. She always says like, be careful of your friends. Like, you know, when you see like organizations that are, you know, predominantly white that are like friends of the Indians, they're like, be careful of those folks. Like they're trying to help, but they're not really. So we see like these cycles over time. So basically, you know, the Native American voting rights, we got the right to vote in, let's see, I have this here, 1924, it should be, yes. So the Indian Citizenship Act was passed in 1924. And it was actually it's a complicated story, but it was like some of our people wanted it and other people didn't. So it wasn't like a thing that it was just like, we're so happy now that we have this act. At the time, you know, because we were taken away from our traditional homelands and mostly put on reservations that were very, you know, they try to make us into farmers on land that's not farmable, you know. So again, this whole dependency, it was passed during a context of a lot of hardship in our communities. So, you know, but, you know, some people did struggle for that. And over time, so at the beginning, like our views on our relationship, you know, it was tenuous because our tribal leaders were worried that if we started to participate in this government system, that the government would then have the authority to dictate that we no longer were our own sovereign nations. So I don't know if you all know this concept of sovereignty. Could you raise your hand if you do? Okay, yeah, about half of folks. So basically, you know, sovereignty is the idea that our nations predated any European foreign powers, and we are our own nations. We have our own right to self-governance. We have our own right to carry on our traditions, to hold our lands, and to protect our children and families, amongst a whole lot of other things that if you want to know the whole rights framework, you could, you know, look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so sovereignty is inherent, it's not provided. So basically, you know, when the Europeans' powers came over, they actually created treaties with the nations, which were agreements about land use and, you know, basically codified that American Indian tribes are in fact nations. There were nation-to-nation agreements. So our tribes, when the Citizenship Act passed, were very worried that if we started to participate, all of a sudden the government would cease to see us as sovereign nations. And so that is, I feel like, a really core piece of the what would you say, the rub that we experience through voting rights even today. So I will also say that it's very interesting because although we got the right to vote in federal elections, many states did not grant us the right to vote. So we could not vote in state elections. So you see examples of, for example, in Arizona, New Mexico, they had to fight as recent as the 1950s to get the right to vote in local and state elections. And I think there's an example, I'm forgetting which state, but they didn't get the right to vote until the 1960s in their state elections. And that for me sounds shocking until I realized that how insidious currently, contemporarily, we are also still being suppressed and still being, there are conditions that make it practically impossible for us to vote now. So I don't really think the struggle around voting rights is over. I think many of us have more access, but this struggle really continues. So although we have it in theory in 1924, we still really don't have Native American voting rights in this country. I see a whole bunch of hands raised, so I'm curious about what the questions are. So Saru,
no, you should keep going, Chrissie. We'll have plenty of time. You're with us till 11:30, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we'll have plenty of time. You finish your thoughts, and then you and I can talk for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to the hands.
Beautiful. So, yes, so very, very difficult landscape, very difficult history for us to then work in this landscape of Native American voting rights. Also wanted to mention the importance of the Voting Rights Act for us. So Native Americans have had the most Voting Rights Act cases taken up by the Supreme Court. There's been about 75 known cases, and that we're not able to take up litigation through that mechanism, but we still really use a legal strategy as a way for us to fight for our voting rights. So I'll just, some of the examples of what kinds of premises that we fight for those rights are, they include challenges to at-large elections. So basically, packing a district. I'll give you a recent example of that happening in Navajo Nation. It's very at the tip of the northern part of the Navajo Nation in San Juan County, Utah. It's a very rural area. It's about 65% Native American, mostly Navajo, some Ute as well. And the way that they structured their county commissioner seats, they basically packed all of the Native American areas into one district. So there was one Native seat, and they divided the rest of the county into areas that were predominantly white. So ever since the county has existed, there's only ever been one Native American commissioner, even though it's a 65%, majority Native county. And that place might seem so small, but it's so significant because that's actually the base of where the Bears Ears fight has happened. So, the protection of our sacred lands is really, that county commission has had so much influence on, how there's been a desecration and a minimizing of that sacred site. So, the last election cycle, I'm going to say 2018, well, this has been happening for many years, but the Native American Rights Fund, they have something called the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. They actually, litigated and took the county to court. So through a lot of struggle, they were able to actually redraw the district lines. And, you know, because of so much disenfranchisement, rightly so, Native American peoples didn't really care about who was on the county commission site, like the commissioner, you know, roles, or didn't really feel like they were part of that system or represented. So there was a huge effort to actually go out and canvass and to register people to vote and to talk to them about these new districts. And there were two Native American basically areas where there was a strong chance for them to elect a Native person. But that story is packed with so many twists and turns. If you ever wanted to read up on it, I'll share you know, articles with you. But it's basically a story of how, even though the court was mandating this community to be fair to Native American voters, that the actual county seat, which was you know, very white Mormon heavy influence, did not want to give up that power. And so you see them do all kinds of things to actually suppress that and make sure that didn't happen. So everything from kicking off thousands of Native American voters off of their voter registration list and having to re-register, to contesting people's registration because they live in rural reservation areas. So they basically made those votes null because they said that they weren't properly like in the district line. So they kicked a whole bunch of people out that way. They actually, the county clerk actually pulled people off, Native people that were winning, off of the ballot, and said that they were, that, you know, they didn't live in the right district to run. So there was examples of sheriffs or whatever the county police were coming to people's homes on their reservation and intimidating them. This happened 2 years ago, right? and what had to continue to happen is to go back and take things to court. And so, you know, thankfully, this doesn't happen in all cases, but thankfully at every turn, they kept taking it back to the court, and the court would overrule what the county was doing. But this was a long battle. So, you know, the story, the final punchline there is that they were actually able to organize, and for the first time ever in 2018, there are 2 of 3 of those county commissioners are actually Native American. So, you know, we see that in our own, you know, time, this whole litigation strategy that's really important. I think maybe where I would want to go next is just kind of giving you some of the kind of contemporary landscape and understanding of kind of where we're at as far as, you know, how we're working to make sure that Native votes, that Native people are engaged, and that we're, you know, turning people out to vote in this election cycle. But I could also talk more about other, you know, Voting Rights Act cases. I'll share another good story. So in North Dakota, I'm sure you saw during the last cycles that there's been a lot of fights around voter ID laws in Indian communities. And in North Dakota, it, you know, was really egregious about making people have like forms of ID that have an address on them when people on reservations don't have addresses. And so it would, you know, effectively disenfranchise like thousands and thousands of Native voters. We were able to fight back on that. But my favorite part of the story of that whole struggle was the fact that the man who introduced that legislation in North Dakota was actually, during the same cycle that law was enacted, actually beat him, a Native American woman, Ruth Ann Buffalo, actually beat him and unseated him in his seat, which I love that story. It's like immediate, like karma. It's immediate payback. And we see these examples. It's so interesting. Like there are so many Native people in very rural, very conservative areas in the country. Yet, and we have Republicans, we have independents, we have, you know, we're not a homogenous, although we do lean majority Democrat. But there are examples of Indigenous women in particular that even when they're in a predominantly red space, these examples that I am thinking of, that they're able to actually win in predominantly red spaces when there's not even a Native American majority. So Ruth Ann Buffalo is one example. I mean, Congresswoman Sharice Davids in Kansas, you know, is another. There are just so many examples that we have of us being able to win against all odds. I'm going to stop there because I feel like I'm rambling now, and I just want to make sure I'm really focused and talking about what you want me to focus on. Sorry.
No, it's great. It's wonderful to have you. Thank you again for being with us today. I did want to go back to your initial comments about, you know, young people really feeling like voter, you know, what is voting and why that's not relevant, and all the organizing work you've done in your life, you know, including the fight to in LA, at least, to change from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. How do you see the organizing and social movement work connected to the voter engagement work, or how has your perspective on that changed over time?
Yeah, thank you. So there was about, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, one of our partners, the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, they held, they chose 12 cities to hold focus groups on political participation. And they held 2 focus groups in each area, one of the Native leadership to talk about, you know, political representation and participation. And they held another focus group with elected leaders to talk with them about their perceptions of Native peoples and their Native constituents. And although they were anonymous, we did get to get like the summary versions and some quotes from those sessions. And one of them particularly struck me as something that I was so upset about. And basically he said, you know, well, I don't really have to worry about my Native constituents because they don't vote. We don't really know who they are. Like, we don't understand their issues. Like, this feeling of just like, you know, we don't matter, you know, we don't count. We're not big enough of a community. There's no responsibility that they have. And I was actually glad for that kind of, you know, frank, you know, report back, because what it did for me is to help me to understand why, as we were, you know, in all of these various fights, why we were not really being paid attention to. And we're trying to push on things anywhere from housing and homelessness to education. And our elected officials don't see us as holding any kind of political power. They don't feel responsible to our community and our conditions in our community. And so, you know, that was like the first kind of wake up. And then, you know, over time with organizing in LA, I'll give you the example around Indigenous Peoples Day, given it's a timely conversation. So with the whole fight around Indigenous Peoples Day, I honestly thought that it was going to be a pretty open and shut case. Like, LA City Council is predominantly made up of people of color from communities that I feel like very connected to, that we're all grew up in and raised in. And I just thought it was like a non-issue. Like, I was really, really naive to think that. And it took us 2.5 years to get this thing passed. And in that course of, and I'm actually glad for that time frame, because I think if we did like an open and shut victory, it would have been largely symbolic and nothing would have really changed. But the way and the process was just as important as the actual day changing. So what we had to do was to educate our city council members about Native issues. And I was honestly shocked. I mean, I shouldn't be shocked, but I was shocked about how little they knew about Native American people. And so rightly, like, if you don't even know the basics about us, how are you going to serve us as your constituents? How are you going to address the, you know, our communities? And that, I'll say, ignorance didn't only extend to the North American Native community. It very much extended to our relatives that are indigenous from Mexico and Central America. So, LA County has the largest number of Native people of any other county in the country. I would argue that there's the most Indigenous peoples of Central America and Mexico as well in LA County. Yet our public officials have really no idea and are completely lost on our issues. So much so that, and this is one of our ally city council members. We were sitting and talking through, having a meeting about this, and there was a member of a land-based tribe in LA, and there was myself, and there was also an Indigenous leader from Mesoamerican communities, and the city council member, whom I love, and just it's an indication, I think, more of our system, the systematic erasure of Native and Indigenous peoples, that people don't know these things. So I don't always hold the individual, but this was like a trusted ally, and he turned to us and said, well, I understand why you are fighting for Indigenous Peoples Day, but I don't understand you. Isn't it I don't exactly remember the language, but it was aren't you no longer Indigenous, or what, basically that's totally in the past, talking to Indigenous peoples from Mexico and Central America as if they didn't exist. And I had to step in to say, actually, the largest Indigenous language spoken in the Americas is Mayan. We have the most Mayan speakers of any other, Indigenous group. And then that person was just blown away. So I really, see voting in the context of deep organizing work, and it's changing people's understanding of who we are as peoples. It's it's deep, work around helping elected officials to pass legislation that is actually going to help our children, our families, and communities. It's really part of, in Saru's introduction, she shared that I've co-founded two organizations, one, the California Native Vote Project, and Nationally Advanced Native Political Leadership. And with the California Native Vote Project, what we do is we do something called integrated voter engagement, which I'm not sure if y'all have heard before. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of that before? Okay. Couple people, yeah. So integrated voter engagement is basically the idea that you can't just pop in at the last minute and ask people to vote in the ways that you want them to vote. You actually need, and oftentimes what happens is that somebody, hires a crew to come into a community that's not even from that community, to just do the job of door knocking or whatever the strategy is to turn people out to vote or to vote in a certain way. And integrated voter engagement is the antidote to that. It's not about last minute people helicoptering in from the outside of the community. It's actually about the value system of holding, relationships with community all throughout the year, and moving on issues that the community cares about. So California Native Vote Project, for example, we are working on an Indigenous education campaign, and we run that campaign all throughout the year. We have a youth organizing group, they run throughout the year. So our membership base, we have about 9,000 people in our base throughout the state of California. We're active in 20 counties. Our membership base knows who we are, and they understand our value systems and our vision and what we're about. And we're in constant communication with them, whether that's email, phone, text. So we're a trusted messenger. So the idea of integrated voter engagement is basically that you just don't do vote work outside of the context on its own, but you have to do it in the context of community organizing, fighting for the issues that are gonna support community wellness and health. That's what integrated voter engagement means. So that when the election cycles come up and we come to our membership base, they're with us. So it's easier to pick up the phone or send them a text or send them a mailer. They're okay, we know who these people are. We trust them. Yes, we're gonna move forward in this way. And I'll say that I learned this strategy from other communities. So there's an organization called Community Coalition in LA, that's in South LA, who's been doing this for a very long time. There's another organization called Inner City Struggle in East LA who also takes on this strategy. And they have been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. And we're very new to it, right? We've been doing this for 4 years. And I think that, you know, one of the challenges in our community is that, you know, we are we're a very geographically dispersed community. And again, I told you about those assimilation waves and all those different policies. So in the 1950s and 60s, the government had this program policy called relocation. And so the relocation program, based in essence, was taking people off of reservation communities and bringing them with the promise of economic opportunity. Again, we had like 85–90% unemployment rates on reservations because we were taking off our traditional ways of subsistence living and forced into this dependency relationship with the government. So lots of our grandparents took that up because they wanted to provide for their families. So what would happen is that they would get a one-way bus ticket to these major urban centers. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which used to be the Department of War, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had these satellite offices in cities. And because they saw how other racial ethnic communities were would come together to create like neighborhoods, they didn't want that for us because it was a policy around assimilation. They were seeking to Americanize us. So they strategically placed us housing-wise in separate areas all throughout. And they did this nationally. So even though LA County has the largest urban Indian population in the country, we don't have a neighborhood. We don't have an ethnic enclave. We don't have a space. We're just scattered. So it makes finding Native people to build political power very, very difficult. And I have recently just been so excited about, you know, if there's one silver lining in this pandemic for Native organizing, is that it forced us to look at digital organizing approaches. So I'll give you an example of how like this has helped us to prepare a strategy. We basically did voter registration and voter education and asked people to join our membership base out in the field, like in community events, powwows, and other events. And we register people to vote, we educate them, we do base building, they join as members. Through the last, since we started in 2016, to now, we had about 3,500 people that we had on our list as members that joined through a conversation. And that was really hard work. And we worked, I mean, it sounds like a really small number, but given how dispersed we are and how small our communities are, like that was really, really heavy lifting on subsequent, like, you know, continuous years. Well, in this pandemic, we have figured out how to use like digital organizing strategies. So basically, we realized that, you know, if we create petitions around issues that people care about, we can actually get their contact information. We ask them if they're Native American, and we've been building. We have now a list of 8,000. So over the 2 months, we have found, you know, whatever, my math is horrible, but that many more thousand Native American people through a digital strategy. So now I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, this is not just good around voting and political power. This is about community building. This is about fortifying our traditional Indigenous languages. This is about making sure our children understand their culture, like to find Native American people. And it's that just that alone to connect to community is really pushing back against that policy, which was meant to isolate us and meant to Americanize us. And so we have more ability to find our people through this organizing strategy, through this colonial vote project, right? So we're just super excited if we've been able to build this base and grow this list in just this short time frame, like how many people we can eventually get up to. So in the state of California, also the largest population of Native people than any other state in the country. There are about 1 million Native peoples here. And there's 500,000 eligible voters, and that's because we're a very young population. So we are tending to have a lot of children who are currently ineligible to vote, but so there's about 500,000 eligible voters, and our goal is to have a base of 10% of them, so 50,000 voters. And I always thought that was an impossible number to hit, and now I don't think it's impossible because of this digital strategy. So we're super excited about this. Like, we really feel like this is, we are growing our political power, and yeah, lots more to say about that. But again, I'll stop there. Just so Saru is helping me to navigate.
No, I'm so glad you're about how hopeful you are. I mean, there are other signs of hope. You mentioned Sharice Davids, also Deb Haaland. I mean, it's absurd that we've waited this long to have Native American representation in Congress, but do you feel like that is a sign of hope, of changing perspectives, despite all the hate and rhetoric coming from Trump? Do you feel like there's a change in perspective, not only among Native peoples, but non-Native peoples as well, towards the Native population?
I do. I think that when people are understand and have the opportunity to like come in to see our perspective, that people are very willing to do that, and I've been surprised in some of the campaigns that we've run, how I thought we were going to brace for so many trolls. And it's been the opposite. There's been so many allies that are just like, yes, for Native people, this is their land. Like, I was prepared for the worst. Like, the LA Indian Commission put out a COVID PSA, and that one I thought was so like American Pie. Like, there was nothing controversial in it. But oh my God, the trolls, the anti-vaxxers, the disbelievers, like, we literally had like thousands of people saying, stop putting fear in people, and all of these things. So we were prepared for a lot of blowback as we put out these kinds of campaigns, but I'm pretty shocked about how few are really, negative. It's really interesting. But I do think that as we're seeing more Native women, more Native leaders in positions of power, and we are getting visibility like we never had before. So the first time ever during the, Democratic convention, we saw Auntie Deb, as we like to call her, Congresswoman Deb Haaland, provide an address at a really important time slot. And that is so important because we're always included, but we're usually like, at a time where nobody's paying attention or just kind of slotted in. But she was given a prominent speaking role at a very important time. And I think that was the Democratic Party just trying to say, like, look, we're diverse, and finally trying to get that message out there. I have a lot of criticisms of the parties, so I won't get into that as it pertains to Native and Indigenous peoples. But I think as it pertains to like society and people, I think as we start to see more Indigenous peoples in positions of power, that then it's only going to open up the floodgates for other people then to see and to believe that Native people can actually lead. So there was, I did a focus group in New Mexico with a number of Native women that went through an Emerge program, which is to get women into elected office. And there was a Native American cohort. And some of the stories that we heard there were both for people who didn't get elected and for people who got elected, was so much about how people don't look at Native and Indigenous women and think elected leader. Like, people think we're not electable. People do not fund our races early on, which is really important for somebody to be able to be a contender. And so, the story from the woman who wasn't elected, she was an attorney. She'd worked on all kinds of like, community issues, had a lot of connections, but there was an area that was a very wealthy area that, basically determined lots of the how elections turned out. And so she went to door knock, and she said, I went very presentable. I am as the candidate, let's talk about the issues. And she said she got very depressed because very, very soon into that experience, she realized that those folks in that community would never give her the time of day because they did not see who she was. They did not see her value systems. They did not see her experience. They did not see all the things that she brought. They only saw a Navajo woman, and they were like, no, Navajo woman is not going to be a leader in this area. So that was incredibly defeating for her. And she has gone on to do amazing things. So, you know, our stories continue. But on the flip side, there was a state legislator named Georgine Lewis who described how it felt to actually get elected. So she shared that when she went into the legislators' quarters or lounge or whatever you call it within the state capitol, that, you know, she was met by a lot of, you know, older white men who did not look like her. And they basically said, you're in the wrong place. This is for legislators. And you know, so she kept getting these, you know, the people thought she was a cleaning lady. People were, you know, questioning her credentials. And we hear this from Native and Indigenous women all over the country, that even when they're elected, they're not given, you know, any kind of like respect in that way. So I do believe though that, you know, as we can, so it's about who we think we see phenotypically or experience-wise as who can be our leaders. And so I think that as we continue to see more and more, it's only going to open up those floodgates around the mental models that we hold about who are actually leaders in this country.
Awesome. I have one more question, then I know there are a lot of people waiting to ask questions, so we'll open it up. But just lastly, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the Native Voice Network and the way in which you describe it as mobilizing through Indigenous cultural values. Exactly what does that mean? Is that also how you're doing the voter engagement through cultural values and culture? And I would love, if you don't mind, for those that don't know about the Bears Ears fight, for you to talk a little bit about it. And is that at all connected, mobilizing around sacred land, around sacred space? Does that help when it comes to voter engagement and political engagement?
Yes, absolutely. So we have learned in our organizing that, and it's kind of common sense, right? It's like as we're trying to move Native voters, they're not voting to be patriotic, or they're not voting for like civic duty or obligation. Like those kinds of messages don't work with our community. We really have to connect it to the things that our community cares about. And land and water rights is definitely something I think that all Indigenous peoples really share, as a deep understanding that we have a responsibility to the place that we are at. For many reasons, it's a life, it gives us life. I mean, straight up that, you know, which I think somehow people lose sight of that. It's just so basic. It's like, it's water. You know, people on Navajo Nation right now are fighting for water. They're literally like, there's a company that all you have to do is put the piping like less than a mile away in order for them to get water. And there's like this corporation that's like blocking the community from being able to access it. Like right now, that battle is going on. So like, you know, for us to be able to connect, the reason why to build political power, to build Native power, is for us to make sure that we can, you know, take care of our land and water, and take care of our people, take care of our children, take care of our elders. Like that's all of the Indigenous value systems, as well as the values that I've shared about how to organize with each other, that really, I think, helps to ground. So there are like various voting campaigns that are like, land rights can only be protected if you vote, right? So very much drawing the connections between those things. And I'll also share that I think a lot of folks that came out of the Standing Rock movement, do folks know what Standing Rock is? Yeah. So the Standing Rock movement, folks coming out of that fight also recognize that.
So do you actually just mind spending 30 seconds? Because I don't know if everybody knows that, you know, I don't know where people were at. Some people I bet were in high school in this group. So it'd be good if you could just take a few minutes, because it was so pivotal.
Yeah. So right before the last presidential election, which would have been in 2015, basically there was a big fight and a big, beautiful movement that came as a result of it, to protect the Standing Rock Sioux tribe from being encroached by a pipeline that was going to go right under their only and main source of water. And what we say is it's not about if a pipeline is going to burst, it's about when it's going to burst. So all pipelines end up ruining, bursting and ruining grounds and waters. And the Standing Rock Sioux tribe basically put out a call to other Native peoples to say, we need you. They had done all the legal strategies, they had done all of the things, but they basically set up an encampment and said, we need all Native people. They put out an alert. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful, you know, every day is a good day to be Indigenous, but, you know, such a beautiful movement. And I think it really, you know, stirred so much love and action in our community. So I don't know how many people at its height were actually occupying that space, but it was definitely an encampment that was predicated on a spiritual responsibility to the land and the water. And it also revived like traditional ways of being amongst the Lakota people in that space. So it was very much, you know, a spiritual movement. Dave Archambault, who was the chair of the tribe at that time, really talked about pipelines as being a snake, and that, you know, we cut the head of this one snake off, but this snake has many heads. And so Native and Indigenous peoples are fighting pipeline development all across the Turtle Island. But what came out of that movement, though, was a recognition that the people who are making these decisions are actually not people who are holding our same value systems. And so out of that movement, there came a lot of folks who recognized, like, I need to run for office. I actually need to be in these positions of power. It's not enough for us to do our direct action, although that's a critical tactic. Like, we actually need to be occupying these positions so we have a say and we can fight from within. And we saw lots of people deciding to run for office. We saw people who are predominantly direct action organizers starting to come into the electoral space to think about building power differently, which is so exciting for me because, again, I'm a believer that these two things are connected and they feed off of each other. And at least that's what I'm experiencing in my organizing work. So, you know, I think that as we continue to like have these victories, that people are going to see that this is a powerful strategy. I mean, I don't know what the alternative is. Like, a lot of critics or, you know, people within our community that say, like, why are you participating in this colonial system? And I don't know what the alternative is. Like, we live in this colonial system. Sadly, it is a colonial system. And I'm fighting for our community, and these are the tools that I have to fight. So I'm not gonna like not use a tool or a strategy if it's gonna help our people.
All right, I'm gonna shut up and let Professor Cohen start inviting students who've been raising their hands to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chrissy. My name's Michael Marco, and I'm SARA's co-professor. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real honor and a privilege to have you. I had just a quick question of my own that I wanted, and then we'll draw students in. The first of is, you know, your discussion about Native peoples in Los Angeles was really a revelation, I think, and it reminded me of this 1961 movie called The Exiles by Kent McKenzie, which is actually about the indigenous community in Bunker Hill. That Bunker Hill used to be a Native community before it was bulldozed to build, you know, a Disneyland in downtown Los Angeles. So all the things that you were saying really helped me reflect, or it made me think about the power of that movie about urban Indians in Los Angeles. It was really great. I mean, a recent rediscovery cinematically. But what I wanted to ask you specifically about, and if you've seen the movie, like, please feel free to comment on it. But what I wanted to ask you in particular was, something we were trying to articulate earlier in this class, which is, why is it that after the murder of George Floyd and this massive uprising, Black Lives Matter protests, that we quickly turned, and in really moving scenes, particularly in Minnesota, to tearing down statues of Christopher Columbus. And I'm wondering if you could, from your perspective, help us understand and articulate that what is at stake in the relationship between Black Lives Matter and the indigenous rights movements, and how you go from protesting the murder of a Black man in Minnesota to tearing down statues of Christopher Columbus?
Well, first of all, the whole Bunker Hill issue, I will say that my grandparents lived in Bunker Hill when they came over during the relocation wave. So I think lots of us have like grandparents that have like roots in that area. And so, yeah, I don't have more to comment about the movie, but just to say, like, it's part of our own family oral history, that place. But with regard to, you know, the mass movement that has happened, I think, you know, it's not dissimilar to what happened in the 60s. So when we looked at like the Black Power movement, the Chicano movement, I think that those movements are all connected, because we also see then that like the American Indian movement was really catalyzed and inspired by that as well. So I think this just goes to show how connected we are and how connected our movements are. I think that, you know, for us to see people unmonumenting and pulling down racist statues, I don't think it was just Columbus. I think it was Confederate statues as well. So I think that, you know, there's you know, a new awakening, and that people have just had it. I think that the waters of hate that we're swimming in around the overt white supremacy in the White House, I think that, you know, it has propelled people to not go through the usual systems, but actually just take it within their own power to actually pull down these things. And while they're largely symbolic, it's a physical act that actually feels really great. We actually unmonumented a statue of the Junipero Serra. I don't know if you folks know who that is, but, you know, a lot of people lift him up as a, well, he's actually a saint in the Catholic Church now. But for California Indians, like, he represents the Columbus of California. He represents genocide and forced labor camps, slavery, like lots of abuse against women and children. And you know, it was really powerful to pull that down at the time, but it was done within this whole movement wave of saying we've had enough. So as we're marching for Black lives, that we are sophisticated and smart, and we're a large movement, and 40 million people came out to march. So it's like, while we're doing this, we can also do that. Like, it doesn't, you know, I feel like like, if you look at white supremacy and oppression, it attacks everyone at one time, and we got to attack it back all together at one time. It's not one at a time. So for me, I have so much love and appreciation for my sisters who are leaders of the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. And I definitely, like, you know, we're connected, and we have relationships with each other, and they push me forward and inspire me and move me. So, you know, I just feel like our collective liberation is really embedded together. I mean, in 50 years, we're going to see a quote unquote new majority, you know, right? And so I feel like we're at a time where we really need to think about how are we going to work together? Like, what are we looking to build together, and really have this like aspirational, hopeful, like creative dream of what we want to create collectively, and not let this hatred, and honestly what is the minority and will continue to be even a smaller minority, to not let that you know, reaction take up our creativity and our joy and our ability to dream and to create something new, because this shit is not working for us. It's not working for anyone. So that's what gives me a lot of you know, hope and strength. And I think people are hungry for that. I think, you know, there's so much chaos and hate and all these things. It's like we need to lean into the creativity and the joy and the vision that we have for collective liberation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was really inspiring. Wonderful. I'm going to turn to the students now and ask them to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It's been so inspiring. And I guess my question was sort of, what's the, could you expand a little bit more on how the Indigenous movement sort of connects to efforts for environmental justice?
Absolutely. So environmental justice is not my area of expertise, and I have not directly organized it. I've been organized to support it, but it's not my area. And I hesitate on this one a little bit because I think that the master narrative, I don't know if you saw these 70s commercials, but like we're very much put into these stereotypes as Native and Indigenous peoples. And while we very much are part and in lots of ways leading the environmental justice movement, I think that like a little bit of the fear and trepidation is that, you know, people I think in our society we also hold this idea of like, you know, Native peoples and Mother Earth and this kind of, what would you say, like a romanticized way, right? So, but I will say that, you know, I have such deep respect for organizers that are Native, that are working in the environmental justice space, and who have been able to really transform that space and to get a lot of the non-Native organizations and leaders that I think they have a lot of the investments from philanthropy and such, to get them to understand how Native people need to lead the way in that movement. And so, you know, at the marches, you know, being recognized and in these like climate justice actions for Native people and just peoples to lead those marches, not only physically, right, but like we want to be part of the major part of the strategy development and like all up and down, like all of the various roles. And that our people have been fighting for this since contact, right? This isn't like a new thing that has just happened, but we have generations and generations and generations of our people that have been like in these fights for the long haul. So yeah, I guess that's what I would share about that question. Yeah.
Great, let's go to our next question.
Okay, hi, thank you so much for everything you said. I feel like there was so much sincerity and it really resonated. So I guess my question is a two-part question, but it's that you were mentioning about like colonialism. So do you feel like the oppression that Native peoples have endured has a connection to capitalism? And then you also mentioned that you have to work the system and that, you know, you live under our society and there's only so much you can do. So taking that into account, what can we do under our current system to help Indigenous people thrive?
Thank you so much. So yes, I think that both capitalism and patriarchy are, you know, what has occurred since colonialism and genocide has happened. I very much believe that prior to, it's kind of hard for us to imagine like a world different than ours, but I think because we're going back to the way our traditional societies were structured, but they were not capitalistic and they were not patriarchal. And so it's maybe easier for us to like make that shift of like understanding how these systems have encroached upon us. But as far as the question about what folks can do to be good allies with Indigenous peoples, I think there are many things, but some of the first things that come to mind are one, to really see yourselves as responsible for not only knowing, but in some way contributing to the Indigenous peoples whose lands that you're on. And many people do not know the lands that they're on, let alone have some kind of feeling of responsibility or relationship with those peoples. So that would be my first thing to say. And the second thing would be to, you know, take responsibility for your own education around the history that this country has had with Native American people. And that's more difficult. You know, it would involve people like independently going out reading or, you know, learning in other ways. But this educational system is very, very intentionally excludes Native peoples from the curriculum. So you're not going to get that on your own unless you actively seek it out. And, you know, what we say is that we are constantly in a state of microaggression as Native people, because we constantly have to tell people what our history is. We constantly have to educate people about our issues, because we are, you know, intentionally erased and not part of the educational system. So I think that the Illuminatives, they did this big national study, and they found that I think it was somewhere about 65% of Americans didn't know whether Native Americans still existed or not. And then they found that 25 states like had no mention of Native Americans whatsoever in their curriculum from pre-K to 12th grade. And those that did have a mention, that there was no mention of Native Americans after 1900. So our educational systems continue to, like, you know, put this myth out there that we are of the past, we're people of the past, but not about anything contemporary of the future. So I taught American Indian Studies 101 at UCLA, like as a TA. And the first thing that I did it a couple quarters, is to open up to whatever questions that people had. People had such basic questions, even about just our mere existence, right? So I would say that those two things would be the most powerful. And then if you wanted to, like, really get involved and help with organizing and volunteering, like, there's a whole bunch of things that I can share with you if you wanted to engage in that deeper way. But I would start with your own kind of conscious, you know, understanding of Native and Indigenous peoples and issues. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, wonderful. While I'm, you know, on the, and Chrissie, I'll ask you to add to the bibliography, but I would offer this book. This is Nick Estes, Our History is the Future, which starts with the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle and offers an entire history of Lakota resistance to settler colonialism in North America. Roxanne Dunbar's Ortiz, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. This is a comprehensive history of settler colonialism and Native resistance in the US. And then if you're interested in the history of Columbus Day, I offer you this, Michel Rolfe-Trio's Silencing the Past. He's a Haitian historian who writes very eloquently about the history of the Haitian Revolution, but there's two great chapters in here about the long, detailed history of how Columbus Day became a holiday. So these are three books that I would offer just as good intro works that anyone can read and understand to help get a deeper base in Native American history and its contemporary politics. Chrissie, do you want to add anything to that reading list?
Yes, I would just say that that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz book also has a young adult version. So if you want to help your young people in your life to also understand, to not have to get to Berkeley to start to get that, is how I felt. Like, I went to UCLA American Indian Studies graduate program, and I was pissed. I was like, why do I have to come to graduate school to learn my history? Like, why did nobody tell me these things? So the younger you can push that down, like, the better. So, you know, that young adult version is fantastic. My 6th, 7th, and 8th grade nieces and nephews have copies of those.
For your younger brothers and sisters out there. Like,
yes.
Thank you for that. No, that's great. All right, let's on to another student question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This has been super interesting. My question basically comes from the idea that colonize and decolonize has kind of made its way into social justice vernacular, such as people saying that education or academia is a colonized space, but there's been a lot of pushback against this as well, namely the paper Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which is kind of where my question comes from. So how do we honor the Native experience while also addressing the impact that colonialism and racism has had on spaces like education and academia?
So I'm curious, like, what do you think, like, what would your response to that be?
I think it's important to address the impact of colonialism on education, but again, I think colonize is such a specific word, and that's kind of the thesis of the paper, is that it's specifically to address the impact that the Native people faced. And so I think it's just like, we can't just co-opt other people's words, and I think it's being co-opted at large by namely white people who are using it and just throwing around the term without kind of understanding the heaviness that it has. I don't know if there's a better word to use, which is kind of why this question is where this question comes from.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, the idea that allowed colonialism to happen is white supremacy. And so for me, it's like attacking white supremacy, you know, is a good start for non-Native folks, I believe, because it really, it covers like so much in that, and really kind of attacks that kind of root idea at the core, which is like we're in a battle around ideas and value systems that then like matriculate to a whole bunch of other stuff. But it's interesting, like the word colonization and decolonize, I'll say that I've struggled with it a little bit, because I'm like, what does that really mean? You know, but for me, I was in an organizing retreat with several Native organizers, and we were talking about how to decolonize organizing, because organizing, one of our elders pointed out to us, there are a lot of militaristic terms in organizing. Who is our target? You know, the opposition, like our elders shared like those things are very violent in and of themselves. And so we were having this meeting about how do we indigenize our organizing, and what does this decolonize mean? And so we left that meeting with the agreement that what it means is going back to our original instructions. So I honestly don't use the word decolonize a whole lot, but I think about it in the context of our original teachings around our value systems, around our languages, around our cultures, that, you know, if we are honoring and holding true to those things, that in essence is decolonial. So that's kind of where I sit with it.
Terrific, thank you. Next question.
Hi, so my question was kind of about governance in Native nations. So it was, how do Indigenous values manifest themselves in governance within Native nations, and what can US institutions and political leaders learn from this different style of governance?
So there are, you know, about 600 federally recognized tribes in the now called US, and there are thousands of either state or unrecognized tribes as well. And so there's a really, really big diversity of what tribal government systems actually look like. And I would also say that, you know, again, one of these assimilation policies, one of them was the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which was very, very harmful of Native peoples and traditional forms of governance, because what it did is it basically brought boilerplate constitutional language to each tribe, and had them adopt a constitution that mirrored the US Constitution in lots of ways. And then the ways that they got us to quote unquote approve those constitutions was super shady. So, I mean, like, it was a farce, basically. There were really not voting mechanisms to put that in place. And what happened is that our traditional forms of governance and leadership were all of a sudden at odds with this new government structure that was created. So even in our tribal government systems, although we really, you know, respect and uphold them as systems that are holding our nation's tribal sovereignty, even the tribal governments themselves have been, you know, a product of that kind of colonial assimilative effort. So, you know, what I do see in our tribes is that our peoples are incredibly resilient and are utilizing structures that really don't work for us in the best ways possible. But I think, you know, our tribes are so underinvested in that they're, you know, potentially like don't even have the resources or infrastructure to be able to do all the things that they wanted to be able to do for our citizenry. And that is nominally changed by some of the gaming gains that we have made. So there are examples of, communities and tribal governments that are just doing phenomenally and have been able to diversify economically, and that has given them resources to bring back their languages, to make sure our cultures are live and active. And so we see those examples, but those even, it's popular perception that lots of Native nations have gaming, but it's actually a very few. And then even fewer than that are actually financially successful. So, I guess my short answer is that it really, really depends on each tribal nation. Like, there's really not a way, like, they're not a homogenous as far as tribal governments are concerned.
Great. Sarah, do you want to just wrap things?
Yeah, Chrissy, I want to be conscious of time because I had asked you to stay till 11:30, and I assume you have to go. We do have class till 12, so if you had a few more minutes, we'll love to have you, but I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for joining.
I have lots of IPD stuff going on.
Yeah, no, we so appreciate your time and your inspiration. Do you want to, you have such an amazingly hopeful perspective. Do you want to leave us with any thoughts about kind of what keeps you going and hopeful in this moment?
Yeah, it's the love of our people. And it's actually, the connection that we have to our community that keeps us moving along. And, even in virtual spaces like this, like the head nods, the energy that you're giving back also like gives me energy too. So even though this felt like a very one way, like, I appreciate all of the kind of love and acceptance and the yeses, like that actually really helps me in all, the spaces where I feel like my cup is filled again. So, it's just love of our people and connection that really keeps me going. So thank you.
All of us going. Thank you so much, Chrissy. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us today. Lots of students are joining me and saying thank you.
Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Great. Well, that was, I knew it would be so on point, but it was so incredibly on point with things that we've been talking about throughout the class and even this unit on social movements. So I do want to allow for more questions and conversation about the things she said, but I thought I'd throw in a little bit. She mentioned this thing called integrated voter engagement, which in the field we called IVE. And I did just want to throw in a little bit about the relationship between social movement organizing and voter engagement. She talked about it at length. And then we can talk both about that and about your more thoughts and questions about the things that she raised in particular, if that's okay, unless Professor Coyne had something else you wanted to raise before we transition. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Those of you that were in my social movements class will remember hearing about this, but there's been a real huge shift in the organizing world over the last couple of years. Prior to, actually, before I share, let me just say this so you don't get distracted. Prior to 2016, there was a real genuine, I will say, distrust and dislike between the voter and civic engagement, political engagement world, frankly, largely very much controlled by the Democratic Party and organizations that were somehow tied to the Democratic Party and the organizing world. There was this, sense among the organizing world that people engaged in political work, voter engagement, were very transactional. And what that means is they would come into a community, as Chrissy mentioned, often from outside, say, vote, 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 you've got to vote. There would be a lot of talk about, like, why do people not vote? What's wrong with them? And then leave, and then up and leave. And they wouldn't hire people from the community. They wouldn't talk to people who they thought were unlikely to vote. And on the other side, there was also a lot of dismissal by that world of the organizing world. The organizing world thought the political world was transactional, was using communities, would come in and out, was focused only on voting and not on organizing. And the political world, for its side, saw the organizing world as very small, couldn't reach the kinds of numbers that the political world could reach, not at scale, unable to really kind of hold power, political power. And so there was a real distrust and inability to kind of work together. There were huge exceptions. So Chrissie mentioned Community Coalition in LA, which led the work on integrated voter engagement, the idea that you can integrate social movement organizing and voter engagement. That's really what that is, make it year round. So, you know, I'm talking at a very sort of black and white, unnuanced level, but there was this large distrust. Chrissie mentioned she felt that way. That's certainly how I grew up for many years in the organizing world, just complete distrust of the political world and vice versa. But 2016 really changed everything because there was such an understanding that what happened in 2016 demonstrated the failure of traditional political work, traditional voter work. So first, to understand kind of the differences, it's really important to understand how, you know, people again use organizing in this very broad way. Some people think of organizing as political work. When I hire people and I say you need to have organizing experience, people will say, yes, well, I work for this political campaign and this political campaign, and it's not the same. The goal of our electoral work is to win a candidate. It's a candidate campaign. You're not creating members. You're not developing a permanent base of people to win an issue and build power over the long term. You've got a finite timeline, which is an election. You're trying to win a campaign. The goal of organizing, as I've said multiple times now, is not actually just winning an issue in a particular election cycle or with a finite timeline. You are trying to build a long-term permanent base of power, collective power. And remember that spiral. Every issue you're fighting for is growing the spiral, is growing the number of people engaged, is growing your political power. That is not how electoral work has traditionally operated. It's not to build the power of people. It's to build the power of a party or to build the power of candidates. It's not to build the power of people. And organizing work can keep going forever, way past winning a vote. They'll be around, they'll be connected to their community. They'll be around to implement a vote or a win, not just to win it. Whereas electoral work really just is around for that one timeline. And it really involves, as I've talked about with you before, one role, which is voting. There's only one role for people in electoral work, which is voting. Yes, people can become volunteers, they can get other people engaged, but ultimately everybody's engaged around one type of democratic engagement, which is voting. Whereas in organizing, people's leadership can take on many roles. It can be leading marches, as she talked about, having Indigenous people lead climate marches, be a part of developing strategy for marches. It can be figure out how you're going to take on particular elected officials. It can be designing what you're fighting for, not just how, but what you're fighting for. So the people themselves can define leadership in so many different ways in organizing, in ways that it just doesn't work in the electoral space, or it hasn't, at least traditionally, in the way that was really led by the Democratic Party in the past. But on the other hand, many of us over many decades have realized in the organizing world that obviously we can't do without voting. Voting has to be an integral part of our organizing work, but we have to recognize it as one tool of many. There's voting, then there's mobilization, then there's targeting elected officials, then there's, you know, communications work. There's so many different ways to organize, mobilize, lift up people's collective voice and power, and voting and electoral campaigns is just one piece of that. But it's obviously a necessary piece, because in order to win, we have to get people elected who will actually vote on our issues that we're trying to get passed. But also demonstrating our power involves not only getting people elected, but holding them accountable, getting people out of office if they don't vote in favor of an issue that the people want. So both getting people into office and out of office is a critical part of demonstrating our power. Not the only way that we demonstrate our power, right? Hopefully this year has shown us that people can demonstrate power in a million different ways, and they have, without even voting people in or out, but it is one critical way. And especially when electoral campaigns do it right, when they are about elevating social movements, issues, and people power, not just a candidate, they can be a useful tool in an organizing campaign or social movement. So when social movement organizations integrate a campaign, electoral campaign, with organizing, that's what we call IVE, or integrated voter engagement, when the organizing and around issues around people power is connected to getting certain people into office to win those issues, to elevate people's power, or to get people out to demonstrate our power, that we can hold people accountable. And co-governance, you know, co-governance now is defined in so many different ways, just like organizing. There's a whole theory and literature now around co-governance. But one way in which our field is increasingly defining co-governance is this idea that, in fact, social movement organizations can actually nominate their own people into elected office and then actually co-govern with them, meaning that the elected official has a coalition of social movement organizations that they're working with on every decision, on every issue, that they are actually deciding together on a whole slate of issues, on a whole platform of issues, not just on particular issues. So co-governance is increasingly kind of a vision that a lot of left organizations and coalitions are looking at, not just get our people elected, but then hold them both accountable and stay with them, be the wind behind their back and at their side as they make decisions on all issues. So that's the vision and the dream. But the challenges that has faced with traditional electoral work was that traditional electoral work, again, leading up to 2016, was focused only on likely voters, assumed there was this only one vehicle, which is voting for engagement, saw the end goal as an election, contacted voters at most only every 2 to 4 years. There was no communication or relationship building of the kind that Chrissie talked about, building our community. None of that happened with traditional electoral work. And so that really led to just damaging, devastating problems in 2016. And I'm sure everybody here has a lot to say about what went wrong in 2016. So many things. But from the organizing perspective or the social movement perspective, or for people who were working with low-income communities or communities of color around the country, the perspective was, you know, this was coming. This is sort of chickens coming home to roost, because you've ignored tens of millions of people for so long, assuming they were unlikely voters, assuming they were not worth talking to, assuming that their issues didn't matter, that when they didn't vote, or in some cases they voted against their own interests, you said, what's wrong with you? But there was a real, I will say, there was a real reckoning after 2016. The Democratic Party really did begin to think differently, or at least many organizations that huge, you know, there's, you should know, there's a huge machine on the Democratic side of massive, very, very wealthy donors who support lots of voter work on the Democratic side. It's not just that they support the Democratic Party or Democratic candidates. There are very large organizations that large donors support. For example, there's a network of very wealthy donors called the Democracy Alliance. This is high net worth donors that support organizations mostly on the left doing voter engagement, political engagement, from unions to groups like Indivisibles or the Center for Popular Democracy, even Color of Change. I've gotten funding from people in the Democracy Alliance. But prior to 2016, a lot of those high net worth donors, convinced by Democratic pundits and consultants, were focused on, again, likely voters in likely states and counties, not being very, you know, I told you before that the wisdom of those political consultants is don't talk about race. Don't talk about gender. Don't say the words women. These things are third rail, they would say. That was the advice. And just so much proved that all of that was so wrong in 2016. So I told you already about one example of us, that after 2016, when I approached Amanda Renteria, political director, campaign field director for Hillary Clinton, and I said, I'm sitting on 13 million people who don't vote. I know the issue that's going to motivate them. And they said, well, we don't know. We need to see polling to see if this actually would motivate voters. And so we set out to prove them wrong. And so we said, this is a population, mostly women, mostly single mothers, 40% under the age of 24 don't vote, 12% voter turnout rate. And you know, we know that the way to talk to them is not just to go knock on their door from somebody outside their community and say, vote, vote, you should vote, it's good for you, vote. But rather to have their peers talk to them about the issue that matters to them the most, which is their wages. And so we put the issue of one fair wage on the ballot. I explained some of this before, and we succeeded in getting enough signatures to put it on the ballot for November 2018. And then the Republicans took it off the ballot and said, we're going to make this law, because they understood something the Democrats didn't, which is that this would mobilize a lot of low-wage voters, a lot of women, a lot of people of color. And so they passed it. But when they did, they said, we are doing this to keep people from voting. We promise to gut this after the election. So in November 2018, their plan was, let the election happen, and then we promised to decrease the wage back from $12 back down to $3. So we mobilized about 5,000 worker leaders to talk to about 17,000 of their peers, peer-to-peer voter engagement. We also reached another 80,000 voters of color through peer-to-peer voter engagement, all focused on this issue, all about building this base of voters, as Chrissie said, not just for now, not just for November 2018, but for afterward, to actually win the issue. And although they did roll back, we were able to immediately sign up hundreds of new members and mobilize people right after the election on the State House, which to us was so much more important than the actual election. The election was amazing. We had the highest midterm turnout. We increased youth voter turnout 2 to 4%, with 3% voter turnout increase among the whole population, 300%, excuse me, from 12% to 38% voter turnout increase in 2018. And of course, we won friends in the governor and Secretary of State, Attorney General. And as you know, the governor's been recently a victim of an attempted adult napping by a militia, what were they? The Wolverine Watchmen, the Watchmen Wolverines, is that right? But we were a big part of getting Governor Whitmer elected, and also the Secretary of State, Dana Nessel, who's been on the TV a lot talking about this attempted adult napping of Governor Whitmer. But we were very much a part of that. She recognized that. The Democratic Party in Michigan stated pretty publicly we couldn't have won without restaurant workers, and we've recognized our mistakes. So to their credit, I think they have realized that the way they were doing things before was not working. That again, going after unlikely voters once every 2 to 4 years, ignoring large parts of the population, not building. So this work is now called, you could call it IVE, integrated voter engagement, or relational voter engagement. It's essentially using organizing, the theory and practice of developing leaders who reach out to their peers, using organizing in the context of voter engagement, relational voter engagement. But I do have a warning, which is that now a lot of the party is seeing relational voter engagement, or organizing in the case of in the work of voter engagement, as the new hot thing. All the Democracy Alliance high net worth donors are talking about relational voter engagement, relational voter engagement. But the way that they're thinking about it and talking about it is how to turn people out November 3rd. How do we turn people out November 3rd? And what I have been saying over and over again is, if that continues to be the only outcome, we turn out all these millions of Native people and people of color and low-wage workers to vote, because we're now focused on them and their issues, and we're using a different methodology, relational voter engagement. But then our party gets into office, or the Democratic Party, depending on your party, gets into office, and they don't deliver. They don't raise wages. They don't save the Bears Ears Monument or stop the pipelines. They don't do the things that people turned out to vote them on, and that they were talked to about by the party. If they don't deliver, or hear when we're trying to hold them accountable afterwards, I can guarantee you those millions of people who we got engaged in this election will feel so disillusioned, more disillusioned than they were before, and not come back to us. So the idea of relational voter engagement has gained ground. What hasn't gained ground is the idea that the outcome is not just November 3rd. It's continuing to fight after November 3rd, to win the things that people were promised and talked to about. That is the part of voter engagement that has not yet shifted in the political landscape. So I just did want, I mean, we could talk a lot more about what is IVE, what is relational voter engagement, but that is how people like Chrissie and I and other people in the field are seeing organizing as increasingly connected to voter engagement and a potential path forward if it's done the right way. So I'll stop there.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. I mean, there's a number of things that one that we think about is that these are the lessons of 2016, to be sure, but there's also the lessons from 2008, in which Barack Obama built this enormous kind of social movement behind him. Taking all the social movement slogans, "Yes, we can," and all of these, and turning that into a social movement. And then as soon as he got himself into office, he just switched it off. He's like, we got this social movement that got me elected. Now just turn it off.
Well, but I will say, Professor Cohen, we switched it off. Like, I'm not me, but a lot of people on the left also just said, "Oh, we're done. We got Barack Obama elected. We're crying. We're screaming in the streets, and we're done. We're going to bed." We are now going to hold our man accountable or give him the wind that we need to win.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of that. I think that you also get of these kinds of the billionaire class that fund our elections. They want to go for what they think of as swing voters, in part because they tend to be political moderates. They are not going to demand much in the way of change. And when you target a swing voter, it's a twofer. You're taking a vote away from your opponent and bringing it to your side. Whereas it takes a lot more effort to go find a new voter. And when you put that effort in, you're only getting one. And so there's a kind of logic, again, shaped by the winner-take-all system that makes it much harder to do exactly the necessary work that Saru here is talking about. The last thing I would say about the Michigan militia, really briefly, I mean, you did bring this up about Gretchen Whitmer and the stumbling over language of, is it a kidnapping? Right, obviously she's an adult, it's not kidnapping. But more importantly, I mean, what we're talking about is an assassination attempt. They intended to abduct and kill her. Like, this was not that. This was a terrorist attack, and a planned, attempted terrorist attack on the governor of Michigan and her entire body of leadership. So to euphemize it, and you're searching for the language, you're like, but to euphemize it as a kidnapping is really to undermine what's at stake here. Because let's not forget that the Michigan militias have a long and detailed history, and one of the singular members of which was Timothy Mcveigh, the man responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, the single greatest domestic terrorist attack in U.S. history. And Timothy Mcveigh was part of and deliberately connected to white power movements. And so when they talk about militias, what we're talking about is a white power movement. Mcveigh was, in the 90s, deliberately divorced from the white power movement. He was seen as a kind of lone nut, assassin, kind of a terrorist guy. None of that was true. He was deeply embedded in the white power movement. In fact, he'd been traveling the gun show circuit, selling copies of the right wing, the neo-Nazi novel, The Turner Diaries. And in fact, the attack was based on a specific page he was arrested with a copy of this book next to him that showed him how to build an ammonium nitrate fertilizer bomb and blow up a federal building. So the euphemisms around militias and kidnapping is exceedingly dangerous. These are terrorists seeking to murder the elected governor of Michigan. That's a huge story, though. Like that.
Yeah, a few months ago, we actually did a virtual town hall with thousands of unemployed restaurant workers and Governor Whitmer. She did it from home, and she, throughout the town hall, had to keep saying, these, hundreds of people with guns are on my front lawn, and I'm going to have to go in a few minutes to find safety with my children because they're out on my front lawn, throughout the entire town hall. So they've been after her at her home, at her vacation home since the pandemic started.
Yeah, let's just call that what that is. That's terrorism. All right. I mean, great stuff. What questions do you have for Saru about relational voter and social movements and their relationship to election? Vivek, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Professor. I was just curious about how the methods of integrated voter engagement begin. Like, does it begin with peer-to-peer conversations, or does it start with community-oriented training? Like, how do you begin getting people who aren't likely to cast their ballots to actually go out to vote?
So the group's doing IVE, and for those of you in the Bay Area, a really amazing group that's doing this and has been doing it, not copying, I'm sorry, learning from Community Coalition in LA, because we're all in relationship with each other, is APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network in Richmond and Oakland. They're doing this. But so the thing to know about IVE is you can't start it just on your own with a group of people. IVE is done by groups that have been doing community organizing for a long time already. So they have bases of people. And the thing I didn't mention is that, I hope I did. Obviously, I have a bias. I come from the organizing space. We all saw the political world in a certain way, but the thing we knew they had that we never had and that they looked down on us with is scale. They were able to reach, millions of voters. We were able to reach thousands of people in our communities because organizing is hard, labor-intensive work. Relationship building takes so much longer than telling somebody to vote. So it's important to note that a lot of these groups had been doing the work of community organizing at a much smaller scale for many, many years. Then they started to integrate voter engagement into their community organizing. So they were already talking to people about, toxic waste sites or a community benefits agreement against DreamWorks, which was building a studio in LA, or they were already having campaigns on issues in their communities, and then they would start to integrate voter engagement into that organizing work. And the voter engagement they were able to do at much larger scale because, they were having deep relationships with thousands of people, and then those thousands of people would lead them to tens of thousands of more that they could have lighter touch relationships with, or that they could get their leaders who they had deep relationships with to have those relationships with others. So I just want to say IVE and relational voter engagement, you need to start from somewhere. You need to start from a base of people that's already organizing around issues, that understands what their base cares about and is moved by. So Chrissie had the perfect example. Her communities care deeply about land and water. They already knew that. They've been engaging their communities for generations on those issues. So they knew that if they were to talk about voting, they couldn't do it by saying, vote for this candidate, or we all should vote just because it's the right thing to do, or even with this esoteric, we need political power, so let's vote. It was talking about voting in the context of those issues and those relationships they had built over many years. So to answer your question, it starts from the community organizing rather than the voter work starting and then building the community organizing. It's the community organizing first and the voter work built into that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead. Dominic, go ahead.
So, hi, Professor. Yeah, I had a question. I come from San Diego, and it's a very interesting area because it has these pockets of little kind of townships, right? And in my township where I came from in Pacific Beach, we have a town council, which is just another 503c sort of corporation. And I ran and was elected for the board of directors for that town council. And effectively what we had was we had access to a person from the mayor's office, a person from our state senate, a person from our assembly, all these different areas, but we didn't have a specific focus. I found that this was unique to San Diego. And I'm wondering, do you think that this is a good way to build a coalition from the ground up, just starting in a neighborhood with a 503c or something like that?
Yeah, I'm a little confused. So this was an elected office or
Yes,
kind of semi or quasi-elected?
So the entire purpose of this organization is to focus concerns for the neighborhood and have access to your elected officials. So that can mean anything from like beautification, ecosystem concerns, concerns with homeless individuals or safety, whatever it is that's going on in that neighborhood. We provided an outlet for our community to come and talk to our elected officials without always taking a standpoint. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't.
Yeah, it's so funny. Last semester, we did an intensive seminar with a group of graduate students around this idea of co-governance, which I mentioned, this idea that, the way I look at co-governance, it's social movement organizations running somebody from their own and then co-governing. But other people use co-governance to talk about what they call participatory democracy or participatory budgeting or participatory structures. It sounds like what you're talking about is something akin to that. And the only thing I would say, Dominic, is that in my experience and in a lot of organizers' experience, participatory structures that are neutral, what often happens is that the groups with the most power and ability to participate end up doing so, and the people with the least power, income, ability to participate don't. And then there's an assumption that, oh, there was a participatory process. Anybody could have come. Those that came, we listened to them. Those that didn't, we didn't. And so unless it's tied to deep intentional work of organizing and uplifting the voices of the most marginalized, the structures in and of themselves, if they're neutral, don't help. So you need both. You need the participatory structures that allow for everybody to participate in a neighborhood or community, but then you actually need to be doing the work of organizing and making sure those that are least likely to be heard, least likely to have their voices listened to, least likely to be able to even show up to a town council meeting or have the time to do that, are heard collectively, not just individuals who have time. I mean, it's like the show Parks and Recreation, right? Like, you know those shows where people who have time show up to those meetings and they talk for a long time.
Our meetings were largely like that. You get to learn about everybody with every disorder, personality disorder that you could possibly imagine. They all come in and
right. There's some people who love to participate, and kudos to them. But the masses of people who don't have the ability or wherewithal or capacity or resources to participate, we have to intentionally make sure that they're heard. So the structures aren't enough. The organizing is essential.
Terrific. Thank you. We are officially out of time. So thank you for all of your good questions. We will be back on Wednesday with Zach Norris from the Ella Baker Center here in Oakland. And I thank you all for your time, attention, and outstanding questions for our guest.